This old barn is all that's left of a sprawling farm that once included those ball fields and tennis courts over there, as well as the fields next door. They called it the Poor Farm back in 1901. Now, historians say that the Leelanau County Poor Farm was a key part of the larger community over 100 years ago. But just what was a poor farm? And why should anyone care? Well, let's try to find out, beginning right here in this century-old barn.
I think it's very important. Myself, I'm a barn person, and later part of my career was working on repairing barns all over the state. And so when the county determined that they wanted to get rid of this barn, I couldn't really look away. I got a call and said, would you come over and look at this barn and tell us if it's any good? After I gave my report, there was a newspaper article where some of the county commissioners were standing out here on the ramp saying that the barn is beyond fixing and it's just not any good at all. Well, that set me off. And then there was a short article asking for proposals to take the barn down.
It just was pure happenstance that Barbara and Steve and I were all at the same county commissioners meeting. And that's when they announced they were thinking about this idea of the burn training site for the fire departments. And we were just kind of horrified. So that's really when the three of us started talking.
After the quotes came in on how much it would cost to tear it down and remove it, an idea was floated, well, let's see if we can get with the local fire departments and see if they could use it for a training session.
Barbara kick-started the process of incorporating and turning us into a nonprofit so that we had kind of a platform to go to the county. And it was a little later that the Free Press did the article that generated a lot of interest in one spectacular donation.
It came within one vote of being torn down. But fortunately, at the same time, the nonprofit group came forward and proposed this partnership, so the county gave me time to enter into negotiations to see if we can come up with a long-term agreement.
Our initial goal was to make sure that the county didn't destroy the barn. So we ended up getting a 25-year lease on the property on about 2 acres around the barn. And what our goal is to repair things that needed to be repaired. I think it's also important for what it stands for. This is the only remaining structure of the original Poor Farm. And most people that I've talked to don't know anything about the Poor Farm system. And so it's a piece of history, it's an important piece of Leelanau County history that I think should be interpreted so that people don't lose that knowledge.
So when we look at just poor farms in general and in how that relates to Michigan, it's certainly the origins of all of it comes from Elizabethan poor law, how they were doing things over in Great Britain, going back to Elizabethan times, 1600s. So a poorhouse is a place maintained at public expense to house the needy or dependent people within that particular county. When you get into calling it a poor farm instead of a poor house, the poor farm is where you have that farming agricultural component to it. The idea was that if you were able-bodied, you had to do something while you were there. You were either going to be helping with planting crops or working with animals, helping with laundry.
Michigan's system is entirely local, and it continues to be local in some ways well into the 20th century, to the end of the 20th century. And the county institutions like the County Poor Farm remain local throughout. And what you also have at that time, at the time that the Leelanau institution is built, is you have local public assistance that's administered through the county or the township. And that might be in the form of a grocery order. You could take it to the local grocery store and buy food. It might be a fuel order. Some places would do cash. And in Michigan, the majority of people are helped with outdoor relief in their own homes and simply with assistance often for a short time. But the county system was very much, those institutions were caring for people who simply didn't have any place to go or anyone to care for them. And by the early 20th century, they are becoming very much almost like healthcare institutions.
So the 1910 census tells us that there were about 10,000 people living in Leelanau County, most of them living in rural settings. There were, villages, many of which still exist today: Leland, Suttons Bay, Northport, Glen Arbor. There were businesses in those villages, so that's where people often went to buy groceries, get clothing. The home life at that time, most homes did not have indoor plumbing or electricity, so people had to heat their homes with wood stoves. They had to get their water from pumps outside, bring it inside, heat it up for baths. Refrigeration would not have been available, so they would have been cutting ice off of the inland lakes and storing that for summer use in ice chests to keep goods cold. In the summertime, they would have been doing a lot of canning because of the lack of refrigeration. So if you wanted to be able to eat green beans in the middle of winter, you had to can them. And there was no central heating. So always those wood stoves, and you were always busy, always planning ahead for something, whether you knew winter was coming and you needed to chop wood for your wood stove. In the midst of summer, when your produce in your garden was doing really well, you knew you needed to be on it in terms of canning and preservation of those things so that nothing spoiled and you'd have enough for winter. Every member of the household was likely kept busy. Children did go to school, but oftentimes, especially and most commonly known during the potato harvest, children would have some time off of school so that they could help the family harvest the potatoes and be a meaningful part of all the work that was going on.
Leelanau County's Poor Farm started really much later than most. The first one was constructed in 1828 by Wayne County, and it was part of an institutional phase of our welfare system, our public assistance system, where people who were in need, couldn't financially support themselves, or faced other challenges were put in institutions, and it was considered indoor relief. And it started a long history of making those types of programs as unpleasant and punitive as possible to discourage dependence. The fear was if you provided aid to people, that would encourage people to not be self-supporting. Those ideas never fully go away. We do get a shift in the late 19th century and the progressive era, which is when the Leelanau institution is constructed, where there is more recognition that there are other issues at work here. This is not just about an individual, that there are environmental and structural factors.
There were a variety of reasons that someone would have ended up at the Poor Farm, but a little context is that at that time, there weren't nursing homes, there weren't any state or federal supports for aging people, people with developmental disabilities. Widowers and widows would often end up there because as they aged, there was no one to care for them. There's any sort of disability that would have meant doing what the life we just described, more challenging.
When Leelanau County was putting together the plan for the building, they contracted with Traverse City architect Jen C. Peterson, who was a prominent architect at that time. And what's also interesting with him is that he also then did the architecture for the Benzie County facility, the next county over, for their county infirmary. So you can find a lot of commonalities between the building architecture, how it was set up. The Benzie building is still around today.
What's just struck me over and over during the years we've been doing this research is that it had all these amenities. It had a heating plant, it had a lighting plant, it had indoor plumbing with toilets and tubs. And when you think of, that time period, 1906 to 1908, how many people in Leelanau County had indoor plumbing or central heating?
From the beginning of the Poor Farm, the county hired two people to manage it, the farmer and his wife, and they were called the keeper and matron. and they were housed there. And from what we've been able to tell, there were at least 6 of those. And the residents, there were up to 100 that we are aware of. Unfortunately, the records for this county have been lost at the state level. And so we have been trying to piece them together, and we only have lists that we're trying, and we're needing to continue our research for each one of the residents and the reasons that they were there, why they were not able to live independently.
When Poor Farm residents died, the county provided a casket and burial at Rose Hill Cemetery. Whatever markers there might have been are gone now. We don't know all their names or burial sites. We have only the Pauper's Field to remind us, and the Poor Farm Barn.
The Craker family diaries are just such an important piece because it's the direct voice of the people who were living there, interacting with the residents and that kind of thing. It was their day-to-day life. So in terms of being a historian, that's the gold right there, those diaries. And so it's really amazing that the family held on to them, that they took the effort to transcribe them, and then now have taken that next step to deposit them in a public archive so that they're safe for years and years to come.
I think our great-grandparents were well respected because they took on this kind of a job that really required patience, tolerance, all kinds of industry hard work, and management to get things working together and to get the people to work together, because many of these people were not just poor. Some were mentally ill, and others were just at the end of their life. Also have to be strong and make them work, because many of them had to work for the farm to operate in order to feed the chickens and milk the cows and plant the seeds and harvest.
Here are a couple of entries from the diary of W.A. Craker from 1919. September 9. Finished cutting corn by 10 a.m. Lewis quit work, hauled beans in, had one very heavy load. Mr. Murray, the inspector, was here, but I was in the fields. September 10th, cloudy and cooler. Mr. Myers shot himself, but not bad. Made cider.
It was all by hand. Everything was done with animal power or people power. They never had tractors on this farm, and so it was always done with horses or people. And when you talk about, say, harvesting corn, people went out with a corn knife and cut the stalks of corn, put it into a shock. They took the ears off and husked the corn and then shelled it by hand. And the barn would have been shelter for those processes. And just a few short months, they built this barn. And you could see the marks from the forms that they used to pour the concrete. And all of that concrete was mixed by hand and poured by hand. This is different than a 19th century timber frame barn, and it's not a timber frame. It's a plank frame, and the Shawver type trusses. It's kind of self-explanatory. It's just awe-inspiring, the space here. It represents the type of farming that was done by the type of construction. Everything was done by hand.
I'll give an example of a few of the residents that were there that we have a little information on, which we've gleaned from newspapers and books and from other sources. There was Frank Vert, was a very able-bodied young man who, when he came to the farm, and he was very helpful and very productive. He maintained the garden himself. He was very meticulous about that. He plowed the fields. He did all the farming kind of work. Another resident was a Native American. His name was Ed Jakes. And he was from the Provemont area, and we have some information from a book. He was there because his family had passed away. He had worked on some farms, but I think he needed a place to live. And he was active on the farm. He was a very positive-minded person, and there are memories of him by one of the daughters of a keeper there, that he would ride bareback, horseback, and she would be on the back. Another one was Ida Smith, who was there because she had a stroke. And I'm not sure, she probably lived there only a few years, but she was bedridden. And we have a picture of her and what that room looked like.
The Poor Farm keepers and residents are gone now, but there are people who remember. In fact, we can still hear firsthand accounts from the grandchildren of Charles and Mabel Coleman, keepers of the Poor Farm from 1935 to 1960.
The garden was pretty much in the spot where you've got the garden today. And it was a huge garden. I mean, they had corn and squash and radishes and, everything you could think of. But my grandma and the women that worked in the kitchen canned all that. And they would can 2,500 jars of fruit and vegetables every year. You couldn't touch the fruit room until the supervisors had been there to see it. And everything was canned just perfectly. And everything was in, just a beautiful order.
There was always the sugar shack that was up in the woods. And I do remember that just very faintly, but I do remember, in the spring when maple syrup would be made, going up to the sugar shack. And there would be a number of gentlemen, men up there, and we would all go be a part of it. And it was like a week process of basically people there harvest the sap and making maple syrup. I mean, that was just a big event.
The only time that they had a tractor on the property, as I remember, was when they were filling silo. Mm-hmm. And there was neighbor farmers that would bring their tractors around, and they would help to chop that corn and then bring those, the corn in and then fill that silo. But otherwise, everything was done with that team of draft horses. And snow plowing in the wintertime, Grandpa had built a great big V plow, and he would use all 3 horses and plow the roads, access down to the barn, from the house down to the barn, the driveway around the house, and he used those horses and that big V plow to clear the lanes.
They were Holstein cows. He milked them. I think he had 8 most of the time. He might have had 1 or 2 more than that. And then the calves, but those are all Holstein milking cows that he kept there. Mm-hmm. And they used all the milk right on the farm. So they would actually process the milk there. The old infirmary, or the county building there, had a back room in it where they actually had the separator for the milk. And so the men that worked for him would bring the milk up to the back there, and then Grandpa would process it right there.
Big steel buckets of milk. Mm-hmm. That was the worst part of going to Grandpa and Grandma's, having to walk in that back door where they worked on that milk, because the smell of it was not pleasant, let's put it that way. But then getting in the house, I smelled something cooking, so it was always a fun time going there.
That was a big memory for me too, and I'm sure Barb remembers this, but they had some of the people worked for him there, did the cooking and cleaning and whatnot, and one lady actually was kind of in charge of doing the baking, so she would make donut holes just for us, and that was a big treat. We'd all get the sugar-coated donut holes.
I do remember that. Yeah.
And and then of course making bread. The bread smelled so great. So you go from the stinky back room that Barb was talking about, you go into the good smelling kitchen area there.
It was worthwhile making that walk through that place. Yeah.
So I worked there down at the county farm for Charlie Coleman and what the heck's her name was? I'll come down here anyway, I'll think of it. Worked there cutting corn and filled silo. Of course, you cut it all by hand, hauled in with the horses on a steel wheel wagon and got it up to the silo and had a chopper there to chop it up. Oh, Mabel, Charlie and Mabel Coleman. Then I ate dinner there in the other building that they tore down. What meals we had there. They called it the Poor Farm. I don't know, I think they done pretty good there, you know. They raised just about everything that they ate. They had dairy cows, and they raised the pigs and chickens, and across the road where the recreation area is now, they had crops there, fields of corn and for the silage and potatoes, and that was their recreation area there. They had to go back there and work, you know, instead of play all the time. Time you got done there all day, you was ready to lay down for a few minutes, you know, because we had all horses and we didn't have modern machinery like we got nowadays. And boy, there was good cooks at the infirmary there. I sure enjoyed that. And all the guys sat around the table and have everything they want to eat, and then here they come out with the pies. Oh God, what a deal. And they had one man working there, and he done all the teamwork. He took care of the horses, and he done all the teamwork. I can still see him out there walking behind the drag across the road where the recreation area is now, dragging there. Yeah, that was a beautiful sight there to see all the stuff growing.
So a lot of people used to go there and stay in the winter when they were alone, and then they'd go back to their own home in the summertime. Nowadays, of course, they've got nursing people, they've got people that travel around and that will stop and take care of you, you know, periodically. But years ago, if you didn't feel up to it and you were alone, you went there and stayed the winter, and then you went back to your house in the spring.
As I remember, all of their hay was put up, it was loose hay.
Loose, yeah.
So out in the fields, it was collected, put onto the wagons, a hay wagon, and brought in with a team of horses. And they could back those wagons into that barn. It had a track at the very peak of the barn, and there was a big rope, and then it was like a clam thing that they would unload all that hay with. They piled that hay on both sides of that barn, and they would pile it almost to the roof in that barn. And then they had chutes in the barn that when they were feeding the horses and the cows, they could just throw the hay down for the animals to eat.
Grandpa had, it seemed like he had probably at least a half dozen guys that lived at the farm that each had a special job. You know, one would be good with cattle, one was good with the horses. The other one might be really good at plowing the fields, so, you know, that was his duty, that kind of things. Rhodey Hatch was a interesting lady. She was, I guess her duty that they gave her was to do the peeling of the potatoes. So she had a little spot down in the basement that she'd peel potatoes darn near all day. There's a couple other ladies, I don't remember their names, but she had quite a bit of help that actually, you know, would help do the cooking, because they cooked all the meals right there too. So that was a full-time job just for the ladies in the kitchen.
Everything that they had there, they used there. So it was very economical, but yet it was a great facility to learn a concept of being together and taking part in something that gave them a purpose. And I think that purpose was something that was very important for the county and for these individuals. And it wasn't done alone. It wasn't just something that, you know, my grandpa and grandma were there, you know, taking care of the property and stuff, but it was a community-wide event, and it was something that the entire county was a part of.
I like to think that historic places make people think, make them want to know more. So something like a historical marker, it is just the essence. We try to get at the essence of the history and hopefully inspire people to do more research on their own, more reading on their own, so that if they're interested, they can learn more about it.
There's several reasons why this is an important story to tell. I think one, it's the story of the unknowns. It's the story of the people that sort of drifted off into history and didn't necessarily get their story told.
You can tell stories. That's an important way of preserving the past. Oral tradition is important. You can write books. You can look at old photographs. But to be able to walk up to a structure like that, to walk into it, and maybe there would be exhibits about the activities that went on there that would explain that it is a piece of a larger complex. Being able to be in that space is very important, I think, for fostering an understanding of what happened in the past and how we got to this point.
I think I'm going to bring this back to my training as a scientist, as a forester. We recognize the importance of our old forests as part of the overall health of our ecosystem. I think I kind of equate that to my role as a county commissioner now, and seeing what is our history here in Leelanau County and how all of that is important for us to make our best decisions as we go forward.
As a part-time resident of the county, I was probably less aware of how hard a group of people were at work to save this building. These are historians. We're very lucky. They're historians with a wonderful love of place, and to have people here who are so competent really dug into the history of why this was important, how this became a passion project for them, is inspiring to me, and I hope to others.
So a dedicated group of volunteers saved this old barn from the fire and have been working hard to make repairs. Now what? How will the next generation remember the Leelanau County Poor Farm and maybe make use of the old Poor Farm barn?